Olá, boa tarde, boa noite também para quem não está aqui. Eu sou o Gustavo, professor da casa, e hoje eu tenho o prazer de apresentar a professora Nadia Urbinati, que vai ministrar a aula de encerramento do nosso ano letivo de 2021. A professora Urbinati leciona na Universidade Columbia, em Nova York, desde 1996. Ela publicou dezenas de livros sobre filosofia e teoria política e história do pensamento político. Seus trabalhos foram traduzidos para mais de 11 idiomas. Dos diversos prêmios e distinções que a professora Urbinati já recebeu, destacamos o prêmio Spitz, que foi concedido à professora por causa do livro New on Democracy, considerado pelo Comitê da Conferência Internacional de Estudo do Pensamento Político como melhor livro de teoria democrática publicado no biênio de 2002 e 2003, e o título Commentatore della Repubblica, condecoração que a professora recebeu do presidente da Itália, em 2008, por causa da sua contribuição ao estudo da democracia e difusão do pensamento democrático ao redor do mundo. Nós, do curso de Filosofia da UNESPAR, estamos muito honrados de poder assistir esta aula da professora Urbinati, principalmente por 3 motivos. O primeiro deles é que, ano passado, uma das nossas turmas leu trechos de 2 livros da professora, o livro New on Democracy e o livro Representative Democracy. Então, acho que vai ser muito proveitoso para os nossos acadêmicos e acadêmicas poder ter aula com uma das referências do curso. O segundo motivo é o tema da palestra, que é bastante pertinente dada a atual conjuntura. O Brasil tem sofrido na pele as consequências desse movimento populista de extrema-direita que tem sido observado em diferentes países. Para poder resistir a esse tipo de populismo, precisamos, antes de mais nada, compreender como ele funciona. O trabalho da professora Urbinati, que, segundo matéria publicada pela London School of Economics Review of Books, é uma das pessoas no mundo que há mais tempo pesquisa o fenômeno do populismo, com certeza vai nos ajudar a compreender melhor esse fenômeno que estamos vivendo por aqui. E, por fim, para explicar a alegria que eu sinto, e eu falo aqui em primeira pessoa, em recepcionar a professora Urbinati, eu queria terminar com uma anedota. Quando eu fui estudar com a professora, após o envio de vários formulários que a professora precisou assinar, mesmo sem me conhecer, eu lembro que logo no início, quando eu cheguei, a professora disse que estava feliz, que tinha dado certo de eu ir estudar com ela, porque pouco tempo antes de eu ir para lá, um outro aluno brasileiro tinha entrado em contato com a professora, pedindo documentos para ela assinar, e ela até falou que ela teve que se deslocar por correios para enviar o documento que precisava ser assinado à mão. E, poxa vida, não são muitas pessoas que fazem isso. E eu acho que são nesses pequenos atos que uma grande educadora se revela, uma educadora que se doa, que está preocupada, né, em ajudar os alunos. Então, hoje a gente tem não só uma grande pesquisadora sobre o fenômeno do populismo, como também uma grande educadora. O título da aula da professora é o Populismo como vertigem do Povo-Uno. A tradução simultânea será transmitida no canal do nosso curso e a transmissão com o som original vai ser transmitida no canal da UNESPAR. Quem estiver nos assistindo poderá fazer perguntas pelo chat e essas perguntas vão ser repassadas para a professora quando ela terminar a aula. Professora Nadia, por favor.
This kind
Nadia,
of invitation.
the microphone, yes.
Okay. Do you have my microphone now? Okay, good. Thank you, Gustavo Dell'Acqua, Professor Gustavo Dell'Acqua, for this invitation. And I'm very happy. Just a moment, I have to turn down my volume. Otherwise, okay. Thank you so much for this invitation to talk about populism in your university and with your students and colleagues. Now, I will refer mainly to my book on With Me the People, which was published 2 years ago in English. And also, I will refer to 2 articles I published along with or later after the book. One called the substantialization of popular sovereignty, and the other one on the political theory of populism. Now, let me say, just as an introduction, first of all, the term populism does not correspond to any regime of its own. So it's not like democracy. Democracy is a form of government. Of course, it is more than that. It is also a way of political activity and political presence of the citizens in the public sphere. It is much more than simply a form of government, but for sure, it is a form of government based on the equal distribution of the right to suffrage, and based on the circulation of popular or elite, if you want to say so, or elected leaders, and based on the idea that any form of institutional power is a limited form and should be accountable to the people through the legal system or the rule of law. Through time, democracy has been connected with the constitutional tradition and with representation. These connections of constitutional representation and democracy as the right to vote, this has been constructed, this connection has been constructed through time, and it is, in fact, what we call today representative democracy, which is also a constitutional democracy. So this is very clear. In relation to populism, populism is not a regime of its own, and thus it is used as a polemical category in the everyday life and by our media and journalists, so that it is more and more a loose concept, not clear, but it relies upon actually this ambiguity. And thanks to this ambiguity, we can say that populism is a metamorphosis kind of phenomenon connected to the transformation or the expression of democracy. Thus, this ambiguity connected to the fact that populism is not a regime of its own allows us to see populism as a transformation or as a way in which institutions and procedures that are recognizably democratic can be transformed. And we call that transformation populistic. And I would like to explain why we use this term. In order to go on to express what is a populist change or a populist rendering of democracy or democratic institutions and procedures, I need to make a second introduction or a second part of my introductions that has to do with the fact that populism is, of course, precisely because of its ambiguity and precisely because it doesn't have roots of its own, but is connected to an existing system called representative government or constitutional democracy, as you like. It has different historical expression, different historical phenomena. For instance, we had populism in the 19th century when it was actually codified or the language was used. It was a Russian origin, and then it became very popular and important in America because it was the name of a party. At the end of the 19th century, 1892, in America, a People's Party was founded, very important in a process of contestation against the oligarchic transformation of the Republic. And it was a call for inclusion and for the respect of ordinary citizens. Then populism had other important historical phenomenon in Latin America. And in fact, according to Federico Finkelstein, Latin America is the cradle of populism in the new form we are today interested in. The new form of populism as a form of state power or government in the name of the people, and by transforming or reshaping the procedure and the institutions of democracy. This was indeed a Latin American construction, particularly starting with Perón. What about today? And so my interest is not in history. My interest is not in comparative politics, Latin American versus Europe or versus the United States. My interest is more theoretical. I would like, and this is the reason of my book and my articles, I would like to understand populism as a returning phenomenon today, and how can we recognize it? What is the way in which it transforms or reshapes democratic institutions as we know today? I have to also to add a third element to my introductions. I know very well that populism is historically very contextual, rhetorical contextual also, meaning that in each country, the populist leaders, they use the reference to the people and to the culture of their own country, so that you have a rhetorical content in Argentina or in Brazil or in Ecuador or Venezuela, but you have a different rhetorical content in Italy, in Spain, or in the United States. That is the form, and is the form that interests me, that is the structure is similar, but the content, that is the argument used, the reference to the cultural characteristic of the countries and so on and so forth, these are different. So there is a contextual element we cannot ignore, and it's important always to consider. However, populism is not simply that populism or the other populism or the other populism. It is also a phenomenon we have the ambition of generalizing or transforming into a viable conceptual instrument, although it is ambiguous, as we said. Having said so, I come to my main argument. Now, there are two major interpretative tracks in political theory or political sociology or political science concerning populism. One, I called it minimalist, a minimalist conception of populism connected to the name of Casmude, or in some sense also Cristobal I don't remember. Oh my God, I think. Anyway, Casmude. Minimalist because the assumption is the following. Populism is a thin ideology. Thin because it's not based on a philosophy of history or a conception of society based on class instead of other things or nations. No, it doesn't have a thick conception. It has a minimal one. The minimal one is based simply on a dualism or Manichaeanism between the true people, or simply the people, and the elite. On this Manichaeanism, populism constructs its own legitimacy in the name of the people, and for this reason, it can be actually a form or it can have the ambition of deepening democracy, precisely because it is a contestation, a criticism of the elite. Thus, for Casmude, Carvasser, populism is somehow not connected to a leader, not connected to a conception of representation, but simply to this ideology of the people and the non-people. And it is, in this sense, part of the democratic tradition, although it is not part of the liberal democratic tradition. So for the minimalist readers, there is a democratic conception, but there is a liberal democratic conception also. And they put populism in the box of democracy, and they see liberal democracy as the distinction between a liberal form of democracy and a populist form of democracy. So a populist form of democracy can be illiberal, but is, after all, a democracy. I criticize this conception because, in my view, I come from the Habermasian tradition. In my view, or the Kelsenian tradition in this case, in my view, Kelsen and Habermas are two important scholars of the 20th century interpretation of democracy, and we rely upon their works. Now, they tell us that democracy has been incorporated the liberties that, beginning from the 17th century, has been given to us by the liberal tradition. Liberties like freedom of the press, freedom of thought, freedom of ideas, freedom of expression, if you want to say so, beside the other liberties coming from the economic side, like liberty of property and so on and so forth. Now, according to Habermas or Kelsen, these liberties, the liberties based on opinion, association, and ideas and speech, that's the liberation, this is not simply liberal. This is a way of being of democracy. You cannot have a democracy if you don't have freedom of speech. You don't have a democracy if you are intolerant toward those who are in the opposition. Thus, is not a violation of liberalism, but is a violation of democracy if you have a regime that takes away from citizens or even attacks those basic liberties. So in my view, thus, it is a diminishing value to take away from democracy what belongs to democracy even before liberalism, meaning the basic freedom to be capable as a citizen to express yourself in public without fear of intolerance or violation. This is an important contribution to democracy. This is the minimalist reading. The maximal reading is the most, perhaps, theoretically speaking, rich. It has its founder and its visionary in Ernesto Laclau, who died after he published his important book in 2005 called The Populist Reason. And after him, his wife, Chantal Mouffe, continued the process of transforming populism. This is the maximal conception. Transforming populism in the name that is identical with politics and democracy. So populism, politics, and democracy are one and the same thing, because populism is a majestic political construction of the collective called the people. And thus, in creating the people, it is also the practicing of politics, and thus it is democracy, because democracy is the practice of politics in the process of construction of the people. Thus, for Ernesto Laclau, populism is democracy in its highest, and it is politics in its highest. It's not simply a minimal opposition between the elite and the people. It is the politics of the people that contests and criticizes the politics of those who are not the people, are not democratic either, because they are the few. So in this case, to have a populist democracy, it means that you have a good democracy. Moreover, since we are in a time of secularization, even of ideological secularization, no Marxist ideology, no socialist ideology, finally, we face the secularization of politics fully, because the populist conception and practice of politics doesn't need a conception of history a la Marx, doesn't need to rely upon a ontology or a substratum of something that is not resolvable like the class. With populism, politics does the entire job. It creates the people. And there is a kind of erosion, thanks to this creation of the people, of all forms of sclerotized, metaphysical reification, like the class, for instance, even the nation. So populism is truly a political constructivism. Thus, it's the best way of being for a society. These are two important views. I criticize this view because although I understand and I embrace part of it, for instance, the identification is very important that Ernesto Laclau proposes of representation and in populism, and the idea that indeed populism, since it is a construction, artificial construction, needs a leader, needs the face of a leader in which name or in whose name the people is unified. So the question of representative leadership is very important, and I think it is a great contribution for us to understand populism. However, I criticize this lack of value, or if you want to say so, a non-normative conception, so that the people is simply the part of the majority that wins a situation or a contest, that has the power without any kind of critical normative analysis that can tell us whether this populist government is good or not. Everything is good because it is made in the name of the people. Everything is good because it achieves the large majority of consensus. So consensus ends up by being the legitimacy argument. And this is problematic for me because it upsets the constitutional aspect, the rule of law aspect, that democracy today has been able to incorporate from the Republican tradition, and it's important because it is a guarantee that our freedom and our citizenship power persists regardless of the kind of majority in power. And thus, I come to my interpretation. Now, according to the attempt I give to tell us what is a populist democracy today, I propose the following. First of all, populism is rooted within a representative democracy. So although many populists claim for plebiscitary or suffrage, these are instruments in the hands of representative leaders. So populism is a form of representation. Very important, this point, and I agree with Laclau, is a form of representation because it is a competition, it is a conflict, in fact, over the interpretation of the people. Thus, the people is an important category we have to analyze to understand the way in which a democracy in the representative electoral form and a democracy in a populist form produce what kind of people. Now, in a representative system based on election and pluriparty, thus in which a majority is only one possible majority, not necessarily the best one, contrary to the populists, for whom leaders, for whom instead their democracy, thus their majority, is the superior one because it's the best one. So according to the liberal democratic conception, instead, the procedure thanks to which majorities are formed and they circulate and they alternate, this is the important moment. We call it representative democracy. Whereas according to the populist conception, it is the substantialization almost of the people. That is, the people is the good agent, and thus, once the people got the majority thanks to a leadership or a leader, that government is by definition the most legitimate one. Prior majorities are not as legitimate. Thus, it's not the principle of majority as a procedure that interests a populist democracy, but is a specific majority, is the majority that has power, the powerful majority, or the majority as a way of expressing power. This is very important. It's crucial. It is a form of reification of institutions and procedures. An example. When in 2017, President Donald Trump gave his presentation, his inaugural speech in front of the Capitol in January 2017, he said importantly, crucially, yes, before this day, other majorities were elected. Yes, before these days, other leaders came here to talk to you, legitimately elected. Thus, other majorities before this majority existed and they were legitimate. But this one is more legitimate than the previous one because it's not simply formalistic, it's not simply following the rule, but it is the incorporation of the good because popular majority. The real people dispersed in the society is here through me, not the people in whose name parties mobilize, not the people described by parties, because in fact it's not the people, but is party leaders claiming that they speak for the people. I'm not here as a party leader speaking for the people. I am the mouth of the people. I am the people. I am one of you, and you chose me to bring yourself to Washington. So you see, here is an important transformation of representation, not only of majority. In this case, representation is not simply mandate representation, mandatory representation. Technically speaking, me and you, like candidates, we run for the election and we present our claims, we present proposals, and we come to you asking for giving us or giving me a vote. Once I am elected, once several parties are elected, they don't say, I am you. They say, I am different from you, and I'm trying to fulfill the promises that I made to you, and you from outside, you can see me, you can stimulate me, you can judge me, and at the end of the mandate, you can kick me off power. So between the people and the elected in this conception of representation, which is a mandate conception, is a mandate. I give you a mandate. I mandate you, people. We people mandate you to play the game of representation. In this case, between me, the people, and you representatives, that I give you a mandate, there is a distance. You representatives are not like me. You are different from me. I choose you because there is something in common concerning ideas and projects, but you are not me and not like me. I can have many different ideas from the ideas you share or you have or you propose, but I choose you nonetheless because some of what you propose is connected to my view. In this way, I am not like you, you are not like me, and in this distance between you and me, my monitoring, as citizens, my monitoring power operates. I monitor you, I criticize you, I try to bring a publicity toward what you do, and at the end of the day, I call you upon to judge you and eventually not to renew the mandate. This is the representative democracy according to parties and mandate that we know about. The populist representation is very different. And it reminds us of what Carl Schmitt himself referred to like a Catholic or a Pope-like kind of representation, meaning representation as embodiment. The leader is me, embodies us, because thanks to the leader, we dispersed people are unified into one. And this unification into one makes us, the people, existing, because otherwise we are simply individuals with different preferences, without any connections, living a very distance in distant places. So how can we be unified? We can be unified thanks to a leader who claims to be us, like us, and to unify us, to make us. He makes us into one. And it's like, as Laclau said, all populist movements, they take the name of the leader. Peronist, Berlusconism, Trumpism, because the leader is what gives unity to the people and it defines people. That is very different, because in this case, since there is no difference, no distance between the people and the leader, because the leader creates the people and is the face of the people, well, in this case, the people cannot easily control, actually cannot control at all. The people has simply to be faithful, to have faith, not simply to trust. The trust implies a rational cost and benefit calculus, if you want to say so, prudential calculus. But in this case, it's faith. I believe in the leader. And the leader tells me that I must believe in him because he's one of us. And if he makes mistake, it is simply because the enemies are there all the time, creating problems, imposing a limitation of his power. Otherwise, he would be even more consistent with what he told us at the beginning. So this is an important conception of representation that excludes from representation any forms of accountability and control. Makes no sense to check and control, since without that leader, we as a people wouldn't exist, since we are unified in the leader. Thus, there is no, doesn't make any sense that we claim a separation from the leader, thanks to which we can control the leader. We have to embrace the leader. We have to give ourselves to the leader in a faith kind of religious kind of identification. So a representation as embodiment versus representation as mandate. I have to say that we have to be clear. Representation as embodiment is not new. It comes from well back in the past, particularly when within the Catholic tradition, indeed, the Pope and the Church unifying and creating the Christian unity of the Church, but it also has an important role in politics. In politics, think about the conception of the king embodying the nation, or even the president of a republic that is a parliamentary republic embodying the nation. But be careful. This embodiment of the nation is symbolic. It is the embodiment of the nation in the face of the king, as Hobbes would say, because it is the face of the people toward the external, toward the enemies, toward the outside of the states, but not toward the internal. If you have in mind the Leviathan cover, Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan is the body, is the monster, whose body is made by small, is like a serpent, made by small faces. That is, each of us are the body of the sovereign. And the sovereign ends up with a head. The head is not made of many faces. It's made of one head. But this head, the head of the sovereign, that is the embodiment of the sovereign, is an embodiment whose face is toward the outside. The face, if you have in mind the image, the face of the Leviathan and the eyes of the Leviathan, they look at outside, in front of. They don't look to the people. So representation as a unity is important to unify the state in relation to other states. Thus, is an embodiment that has a function of symbolic unity, not lawmaking or decision-making in domestic politics. That is a crucial point. What the populists do is to transfer that notion of embodiment from the symbolic to the political and thus to lawmaking power. When this happens, well, things can be very problematic. First of all, because the leader claiming to be the people against others who are not the people, who are the establishment, this leader, once in power, needs to prove all the time that is not an establishment. How is possible to have a leader that is inside of the institutions that it doesn't become an establishment like other establishment before him? And this is a problem for populists, because the populists claim that they are not establishment. They claim that they are anti-establishment. Anti-establishment is like an energy for the populists. So how can they prove, once they are in power, that they are not an establishment? This is very difficult. And in order to do so, in order to prove that they will never be an establishment, they will always be a people, ordinary people, they have to be like in a permanent electoral campaign, attacking the adversaries, attacking and creating enemies. So populists in power, they need enemies. They need the elite all the time there. They need those who are critical all the time there, because it can give to them the responsibility of their failures, for instance, or simply of the difficulty in which they find themselves. So the enemy in this case is functional to the existing of the populists in power. Now, populists in power does another important thing that makes us understand why populism is not fascism, although the rhetoric of friends and enemy, the rhetoric of intolerance, the rhetoric against pluralism, they may be identified with a fascist kind of, but fascism is not simply a rhetoric against those who are not part of the same people. Is more than that. It is a regime that wants to have absolute control of the institutions and the society, and uses the coercive power of the state to violate freedom and even to send to jail the adversary in politics. Now, when a populist regime does this kind of politics, is no longer a populist regime, it's already a fascist regime. So I resist to keep the distinction between populist democracy and a fascist regime. Now, until it is a populist in power, a populist democracy, we have election. So the fascist regime abolished elections or transforms elections. I come from Italy, so Mussolini abolished individual suffrage. He made the people only once, by the way, elect from a list without opponent list. Only one list with many sub-fields inside, with corporations inside, so the industrialists, the unions, but all of them fascist, of course, and there were no competing parties. So they were not kind of elections. They were not even called elections. They were called plebiscites. Now, the fascists, the populists in power, they use elections instead. They use elections more than once, if they can, because they want to prove that they are chosen and re-chosen, and thus they use election as elections in a democracy based on mandate, and parties are not. That is, they use elections as an acclamation. So election is not a method or an institution thanks to which we collect our preferences, we count votes, and we declare those who have a majority, temporary majority. So elections is a way of selecting representatives and declaring the majority of them who are supposed to rule, to govern for a while. Now, according to the populists, this is not simply, this is what they say, what Peron used to say, this is a liberal conception. Well, they have a different conception. For them, election is the affirmation or the proof, the evidence that they are the true people. For this reason, Isaiah Berlin, in a very important essay of 1967, he said that it's a paradox to have a populist movement in a minority, because populist wants to be a majority. Populist is only reasonable if he is a majority. Yes, because elections are there to prove, to celebrate the majority of the people. So an election that does not celebrate that people with that leader, well, has been a stolen elections, as Trump used to say all the time. So if I lose elections, don't believe that those elections will be correct. Those will be faulty elections, stolen elections. Why? Because the people cannot lose. How is possible that a majority of the people is not a majority in the electoral outcome? This discrepancy between majority under the leader and majority that is a different one as a result, if there is a contradiction, it means that the majorities in the electoral results is a fake or a faulty majority. So for this reason, I would say that populist democracy, in eliminating the gap between the outside and the inside, between institutions and those who operate within the institutions, it transforms institutions into an object that is possessed, that is owned by the winner of the game. So it is very dangerous because, of course, the risk of violating basic rights is there all the time. But there is another risk, even stronger in my view. Now go back to what representation is. Representation is a construction by the leader, creating the people and declaring his people to be the real people. Fine. Now, in this moment, when it does so, when populism does so, it puts together, this is a great contribution by Ernesto Laclau, who expresses from his point of view, he supported this view. From my point of view, I use it as a description and as an attempt to show how things are problematically, in my view. So the populist leader unifies the people, creates the people by creating equivalents that are not there. For instance, putting together many parts of the societies that are very different. They have only something in common that can be connected to the point of unifying all of them. So practically, if you want to understand even better, a populist unification or a populist unification of the people is a kind of alliance, is a social alliance of many groups or many interests that are different from one another. And this alliance, this unification is strong if the popularity of the leader is strong, right? But the leader, once he is in power, needs to give something to each part of this alliance. Since this alliance is a very artificial construction of him, in order to keep this alliance in action and not to lose pieces and thus to have his alliance destroyed while in government, he needs to satisfy the needs or some needs of all portions, or particularly those important, strong, quantitatively speaking, strong portion of his coalition. And thus, it uses the state in order to strengthen its political power. Thus, paradoxically, populist leaders who became important leaders attacking party democracy because corruption, because compromises, because limits the power of the people by pluralizing the power of the people, well, the populist leader, once in power, becomes very corrupt by necessity, because he needs to use the state in order to pay back and in order to support this very loose alliance. So at the end, born from and thanks to a rhetoric against party politics, because corrupted politics, because compromising politics, a populist in power ends up by being very corrupt and to compromise all the time and to mediate all the time, although it does so in the hide, without showing it. What it shows to the people is the rhetoric of a people all the time under attack by the elite. Thus, the populist democracy is a democracy based on a strong audience, on a strong democracy of the public, if you want to say so. The democracy of the public, or the public that becomes the real sovereign, that has in his hand the opinion in favor or against, this is what defines the strength of a populist democracy. So today, democracy that has a strong and very actually disintermediate kind of opinion formation through the public and through the media and with the celebrity politics of these leaders through the media, well, in today's, in our time, a populist democracy is, unfortunately to say, much more popular and much more easy to be constructed than a party democracy. And with these observation, I like to conclude, and then to hope that we have a discussion and to enrich and to articulate better what I try to say, and I hope that you followed me and you understood what I tried to say, and that the translation the translator was able to follow me, although I realize that I talk very quickly and perhaps too much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nadia. This was a great lecture. Como eu disse, eu vou fazer as perguntas em português, perdão, primeiro em inglês e depois em português. So I will pose the question first in English and then in Portuguese. So my first question is, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, this was a very thought-provoking class. There's a lot to think about. Thank you. One question that I just want to hear on this, I might guess the answer, because you say that we shouldn't make a distinction between good populism and bad populism. Populism is always bad. But what about, isn't there a tension between, on the one hand, your condemnation of populism tout court, and on the other hand, your recognition that populism is contextual? So you start your book and your article saying, well, populism is contextual and this is proverbial, we all know this. So isn't this dependence on context an obstacle when for the scholar who wants to criticize populism in general? Because what about a new colonial context? So in your article, The Political Theory of Populism, which was asked for, we asked students to read, there's one paragraph where you say, you cite Germani, and you say that, well, Germani used to argue that in societies that are not fully formed nation states, populism can play, and this is your expression, a functional project. But you just described it, you don't endorse it. So my question is, maybe in countries that are in the beginning, countries that have been subjected to colonial exploitation for centuries, like this country, maybe in those contexts, populism can be conducive to democracy initially, but then you need to stop. It's like, you know, Rousseau would say in the social contract, revolution happens once.
Yeah.
Okay, but then you need to stop. So this is my question. Maybe do you think that populism can fortify democracy in some context? So now em português. A pergunta que eu fiz para a professora Urbinati foi a seguinte, porque no texto que eu mandei no grupo lá para o pessoal ler, a teoria política do populismo, tem uma passagem onde ela diz que ela cita um teórico italiano do século XX, e ela diz que, segundo esse teórico, o populismo pode desempenhar uma função em países, em estados-nações incipientes, né, em sociedades que ainda não são estados-nações plenamente formados. E minha pergunta foi, bom, será que isso não pode levar a gente a reconhecer que o populismo tem um aspecto salutar, em alguns contextos, e também até o próprio fato da professora reconhecer que o populismo é contextual. Se o populismo é necessariamente contextual, então isso pode servir de obstáculo a quem queira oferecer uma condenação do populismo tout court, né, em geral. So, Nadia, please, what do you have to say?
So, Gustavo, this is, well, you always frame very excellent questions. As far as I remember in the conversation we had or in seminars we had. Here again, this is a great question, is the question in my view. Now, let me say, I don't want to square the circle because it's impossible. I mean, this is not mathematics, it's not arithmetic, this is politics, right? So we have to assume that there is never even the normative conception of democracy is capable of recognizing a hiatus, a hiatus between the existing and the tendency. So, as Dewey used to say, that you like Dewey, and or in our time, Jane Mansbridge, or an author that I like even more, that is Kelsen, there is a kind of, there is a process of approximation to the ideal. And the ideal is the principle. The principle of democracy is based on that assumption that human beings as citizens are equal in front of the law and under the law, and they are absolutely in command of those who are in power through a system based on individual suffrage rights, secret, and then other system of control and so on and so forth. That is, and the idea is to make the citizens capable of self-government more and more by controlling those who are in the institutions, even changing methods for selection, different forms of elections, using strategies for making those who are elected more respondent to people. So all the system of democracy is not yes, no, good, bad. It is an attempt to self-emendation or self-constructions in order to approach as much as possible the principle, the model principle. I call it the principles because for me it's clear. Now, in this permanent tension, you may have moments of populistic kind. When, for instance, the case of Germany in Latin America, or the case of the United States at the end of the 19th century. Now, the condition that brought to this populist phenomenon were conditions that could be constructed in that way in a short period of time. Otherwise, you would wait centuries in order to form the unity of the people or the nation. So to have it in a not usually long time, and thus, of course, you may produce, in doing the good things of creating the nation or as a unity or the people as a unity, you may meanwhile, as a collateral, construct or disseminate the system of something unpleasant or problematic for the system itself. Democracy is capable of amending that. So we don't exclude the possibility of creating these, I wouldn't say bad, but certainly open to different outcomes. Of course, but we assume that democracy is a permanent track or a permanent tension or a permanent self-emendation. And in this sense, we can accept. In this way, we can justify, not by a dualism. That doesn't work, Did I answer you?
Yes, you answered very clear, and I haven't thought about this, and I will briefly translate it, okay? Because o que a professora Urbinati respondeu é que ela falou que existe uma tensão entre o domínio ideal e normativo e o domínio da prática democrática. Então, a democracia é um processo de aproximação a esse ideal normativo, que é um regime onde todos os cidadãos e cidadãs são iguais e livres. Então, pode ser, a professora reconheceu, que em alguns contextos, práticas que... Ela falou que ela não queria usar a palavra ruim, né? Práticas que, em outros contextos, a gente poderia falar que são contrárias à democracia, em certos contextos eles podem favorecer a democracia, né? E isso, mas assim, no longo prazo eles continuam sendo contra a democracia. Então, nesse processo de aproximação do ideal democrático, isso, se tudo der certo, isso vai ser corrigido. Maybe we can think also that the American Revolution was populist. You could say.
Yeah, several people believe that, particularly, not the Federalists, you know, but the anti-Federalists. They really wanted to have a kind of, not a representation through mandate, but a direct representation, or if you want to say so, a representation with the imperative mandate. So there was a tension between an elite conception and a populist conception of democracy, right?
We have more questions from the... we have questions from the audience. Okay. Let's see here. So we have Alison. So Alison, let me just put in the chat, and then it's easier for me to translate. So given the relationship between populism and democracy, how is populism seen in regimes that are apparently democratic, but that are founded on other presuppositions? So,
now, you know, I am a little bit formalistic in myself. What do you mean by apparent? If you assume that democracies are apparently democratic, you presume that there is a true democracy and an appearance of democracy. Now, for me, it's difficult to make this case because it is very hard to say what is the substance and what is the appearance in a kind of dualism. So it's very hard. Thus, I would say, populism is always present in democracy. It's not that it's never present and comes up suddenly here and there through history. It's always here. For instance, an example, in party democracies, when you are very close to election, you have that even parties use the rhetoric of populism. We and them, we are better than worse, and so on, so on. Because this is what the rhetoric is about, right? So, as the ancient used to say, demagoguery is part of democracy. It's not outside, it's inside, right? Now, we call it democracy. Why then? Why we call it democracy and don't we call it populist? Why we call it democracy and don't we call it demagoguery? What is the difference? The difference is, in my view at least, this process of decision making, formation of opinion, the process is democratic. Sometimes this process, although democratic, can have as a content a populist expression or even an antipathetic or oligarchic expression, if you want to say so. So I would make this aspect. This it's like the body, no? It's like the figure, the comment on dit the figure, no? My figure is me. Of course, I change many times through time. I am myself when I was younger, when I am not younger. And people, if you have my mother and my father observing me, they recognize me, although I am very different. So this procedure of myself that is always myself, but is also very different, and these differences are visible. They're not they don't disappear. This is a little bit like in a democracy, in my view. So it's the pure democracy doesn't exist, never, nowhere. But there are limits, there are limits, because if you change too much, or if you introduce elements that change it too much, you don't recognize anymore the body. So if I have a surgery that disfigures my body, my face, you don't recognize me anymore. And I tell you, I'm myself, I'm me, yes, but you're not longer. So it means that democracy has some limits. You cannot change ad libitum forever. There are borders. And this is the problem, because you can stretch democracy to the point that you are still inside of democracy, right? Bolsonaro, I guess, I cannot tell from outside, but I guess is still within a formal democracy. By formal, I mean elections are still here. He didn't abolish them. The Constitution, it didn't cancel the Constitution. It did what he did, as I said, with populism does. He possessed those institutions and made those institutions his own by violating them, by putting his people inside of them, and whatever. But the system is still there. Now, when this stretching goes to the point that the Constitution is no longer working, the elections are no longer in action, well, they're outside of democracy. So democracy has borders. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, these borders are elastic, so that we can have democracies that are very different from one another. And within the history of a country or a democratic country, we have moments in which it is more genuinely connected to the people and less. So even the history internal to democracy is made of up and downs, or is different somehow.
Thank you, Professor. I'm going to translate, not all of it, but briefly, right, in a nutshell. So, Alison, a professora respondeu que ela primeiro começou falando assim, o que você queria dizer, ela se incomodou um pouco com essa diferença entre um regime que é aparentemente democrático e que não respeita, né, tem pressupostos que iriam contra essa... Ela falou que ela é contra esse dualismo, né, entre aparência e essência. Daí ela começou a fazer algumas considerações sobre a democracia, não vou conseguir, né, foi bastante coisa, né, bastante denso, então algumas coisas que eu anotei aqui, né, ela falou, por exemplo, que ela vê a democracia como um processo de deliberação, que então é algo que se realiza no próprio procedimento, não é uma essência, e ela falou que os regimes políticos, eles são elásticos, então há um contínuo, né, então eles comportam mudanças, porém há limites. Então chega a um ponto que você puxa o elástico ele se rompe, ele deixou de ser aquele regime, e isso pode acontecer com a democracia. Ela daí citou como exemplo disso o Bolsonaro. Então, o Bolsonaro, ele ainda está no interior da democracia representativa, porque nós temos eleições competitivas, pluripartidárias, e que, então, você ainda tem, embora ele adote certas práticas autoritárias, ele ainda está dentro desse regime. Mas claro que há a possibilidade de você ir para alguma outra coisa. E ela deu como traço definidor, e essa é uma posição que a professora já escreveu em alguns textos, as eleições, né? Então é isso que é algo que a gente pode usar como característica que separa fascismo e democracia. São eleições pluripartidárias e por aí vai. Let's see if we have other questions. So what about something that so the parasite, there's this metaphor that you say, right, that populism can be like a parasite. So the parasite can be inside the body and we can function, but there's a limit. There's a limit of how much parasites we can take. So there's a limit from and once you cross that limit, then you start disfiguring, you start malfunctioning. And this
not only how many and how much, but the parasite, the paradox of the parasite is that if it goes too far, because it needs to suck the blood of the plant, it destroys the source of his life. So paradoxically, he needs not to exploit too much. He needs to, otherwise he dies, you know. So for this reason, democracy and populism, they die together. When you have a fascism, you don't have neither democracy, neither populism. It's something else, right? So this is the interesting connections between these two elements called populism and democracy. They are together. They are in tension. They ruin one another, but they cannot do at the point of destroying both of each other. So populism doesn't want to destroy completely democracy, not to destroy completely himself, right?
Yeah. It's like the virus, right? The virus is evolving, COVID. It's becoming more mild because this way it can reproduce itself. Because if the person dies, the virus dies also. E a gente estava falando da metáfora do parasita, que existe há teóricos do populismo que caracterizam o populismo recorrendo à metáfora do parasita. O populismo como um parasita. Então a professora falou, bom, se o populismo é um parasita, ele precisa, ele não pode sugar muito o sangue da pessoa da qual ele se aproveita, porque senão a pessoa morre e ele também morre. Então, o populismo, para existir, ele precisa da democracia. My question, and this is more about commentary, right? It's a minor question. In your article, the substantialization, the populist substantialization of popular sovereignty, you sometimes it's not something you affirm, but sometimes you refer to Laclau as if Laclau saw the people in homogeneous terms as Schmidt. I think there's a footnote where you cite Arato and you say, oh, Laclau can be approximated to Schmidt's political theology. But I see a major difference because it's true. If you read Schmidt, you see that the notion of the people that Schmidt defended was homogeneous. He uses those terms, racially homogeneous. But in Laclau, the people is a discursive construction that results out of an articulation of a dynamic chain of equivalencies. So I don't think one can say that, oh, so this approximation for me, I don't know, what do you have to say? But
no. I think you in that article, I should have avoided to use Laclau in that way, because you are right. Laclau is a constructivist. Is a constructivist through this discourse, right? To discourse, and it's not like a Schmidt. Well, also in Schmitt, you have the propaganda of a party constructing his own people, clearly. But he never made the theory of this kind. This was what the things happen in his country in that way, but he didn't theorize politics as a process of constructivization, of construction. I think you're right in developing that criticism of what I could have made the argument without mentioning Laclau in some sense, because I do think though that Laclau makes this kind of effort of savaging populism. That I should have said. He wants to savage populism from substantialization. Because indeed, he made the difference between Marxism with the class, which is a substance, or nationalism. He wants to argue that populism is the only purely political, because purely constructive approach, thus without substance. Mm-hmm. So he wanted to savage, to save populism, if you want to say so. In my view, thus, I should have said that he wanted to save populism from its internal myth of the one. The myth of the one, call it a myth, call it a substance. It is the one. The one doesn't have the plural. He wants to have the one. The one is an important concept in politics that was developed along with this sovereign theory, particularly Hobbes. The one as the subject of the will subject or the sovereign. Well, this myth of the one takes a particularly important role in populism, much more than democracy. Democracy doesn't have this myth of the one, but populism does have, because the populists think that a people that is divided between parties, and one party is against the other one, is a way of weakening the people, weakening the unity of the people. So they believe that the strength of the people relies upon the one. So although Laclau is not guilty of substantialization, populism is.
Então, gente, só desculpa aí não ter pego a tradução. Sorry, I forgot to translate the question, so I'll translate the question and your answer very briefly. Então, eu perguntei para a professora sobre a leitura que ela faz do Laclau no artigo que ela tinha recomendado ler para essa aula, que é aquele sobre a substancialização populista da soberania popular. Então, tem um momento do texto onde a professora cita o Laclau e ela coloca uma nota de rodapé, citando um comentador que associa a noção de povo em Laclau à noção de povo em Schmitt, né, no Carl Schmitt. E eu falei para a professora, bom, mas eu acho que não procede essa aproximação, porque para o Laclau, a noção de povo dele é uma construção discursiva que resulta de uma articulação dinâmica de equivalências. Então, não é uma substância. No caso do Schmitt, tem trechos do Schmitt onde ele fala do povo e ele descreve o povo como homogêneo, é o termo que ele usa, né? É uma mesma raça. Então, você encontra isso no texto do Schmitt, mas não no texto do Laclau. E daí a professora falou que ela reconhece isso, que tem essa diferença, mas que, ao fim e ao cabo, eles têm uma concepção unívoca da soberania. E isso que Então, há aí uma tensão entre uma noção pluralista, né, e diversificada da soberania popular, que consegue acomodar várias demandas e vários grupos, e o Laclau. And so, yeah, I translated very briefly.
Yeah, it's clear. So, just to clarify, I need to add something, because that is an important question. We need to make a distinction between The one is the myth of the chooser, decision maker in the classical tradition of sovereignty, and homogeneity of his internal content. The homogeneity internal content is Schmitt. Schmitt thought that if you don't homogenize the nation, you cannot have the one. In Alaclao, you can have the one without that homogenization because you construct it through rhetoric, through discourse, through ideology, alla Gramsci. But the one remains the one.
Sim. Yes. Yes, very, very good. And I think this is something that I really like about your theory of democratic representation. In one of the class we studied Rousseau versus Mill, sovereignty, and your work on representative democracy, where you make the distinction between unified conceptions of sovereignty and pluralistic conceptions of sovereignty, and how the latter is compatible with democratic representation, whereas the first isn't.
It's not.
Very, very, very interesting.
Yeah, and the first one, then I feel the first one goes together naturally with embodiment, conception of representation.
Yes. Yes. Eu estava falando da diferença. Quem conhece o livro da professora Democracia Representativa, sabe que lá ela faz uma genealogia do conceito de democracia representativa na história da filosofia, e ela diz que o que mais atrapalha a compreensão do conceito de representação democrática são noções unívocas da soberania, e ela mostra isso muito bem no Rousseau. E, enfim, a gente estava comentando isso. Nós temos mais uma pergunta. We have one more question. Nadia, can you read the question in the chat in English?
Let's. Where is it?
So Rayane Araújo.
In what sense is populism democratic? I believe I was able to understand why it is a representative form of government. But it seems to oppose to democracy insofar as it excludes the minority and does not value plurality. It seems instead to identify the rule. Yes, but this is veramente bravo, questo è bravissimo, it's very good. If we refer to, this is great. Now, if we refer to the fourth idea of power as an empty place, populism does not seem to be compatible with democracy because, correct me if I don't understand right, but it was to fill that empty space, right? Now, why we call it democratic again? If we assume this process of approximation to the model or to the principle, we can. If we assume a definition, paradigmatic definition, Cartesian definition, we cannot. But I don't think that democracy stays well with the Cartesian definition, because it would be so simplistic and so, categorical, that wouldn't allow the very contradiction or internal tension that any form of processes is instead capable of. So I understand your point. Your point is very well taken. But I think that is still democratic, because there is no abolition of the condition that make possible to that place to become empty tomorrow. Okay.
So I will translate the question very briefly and your answer. Então, a Rayane Araújo, ela perguntou em que sentido o populismo é democrático. Ela disse que ela conseguiu entender da fala da professora por que o populismo está ligado à representação, e ela disse que ela entendeu que o populismo se opõe à democracia na medida em que ele exclui a minoria e não valoriza o pluralismo. E ela falou que ela fez uma referência ali à ideia do poder vazio, né, do Lefort, e se a gente compreende a democracia nesses termos, o populismo ele não parece compatível com a democracia. A professora respondeu que, de fato, a Rayane tem razão em apontar isso. O que a professora respondeu? Ela disse que o populismo tenta preencher esse lugar vazio. Ele é uma tentativa de preencher, né, esse ato da representação, que caracteriza a democracia dos modernos. Porém, ele não preenche totalmente. Ele ainda está dentro. Uma vez que você preenche completamente, você abole as eleições, você abole a oposição, daí você já está em outro tipo de regime. Mas, e essa é a posição pela qual a Nadia é célebre também, ela acha que ainda é uma forma de democracia representativa, porém uma forma desfigurada. Então é uma democracia representativa que não está funcionando bem, mas que ainda funciona. Rayane, she's studying Rousseau also, and you're one of her references.
Good.
And so to understand this point that you raised, we can remember, I think there's a passage in Émile where Rousseau says, every regime, there's a moment, there's like a gray area where one type of regime touches the other.
Yes.
So this is populism. It's the gray area between perhaps fascism, but not fascism, but the gray area between representative democracy and something else. So, you're Rousseauian. You're Rousseauian. Você é Rousseauiana, yeah.
But not the Rousseau of the social contract. Right? No, but that is a great moment for me, great lecture. I thank you so much because I'm learning a lot. Now, I was thinking, there is now an attempt inside of the discipline. Recently, a book came out by Arato and Cohen on populism and civil society. The idea they have is that the populism is like an hybrid. It's like a mule. A mule is not a donkey and it's not a horse. Is an hybrid. Be careful in doing that, because an hybrid is an entity. It is an animal, exists. It's not a process, either or. You have either a mule or a donkey, right? So it doesn't allow the transition. In my view, this is again a way of categorization that is too straight. You become very intolerant at the end, either or again. No, I think democracy is more parsimonious. More parsimonious, si può dire? Parsimonious. It's less demanding, it's less straightforward.
Mais econômico.
Ecco, è più it's more and it's also capable of better reflecting human fallibility and human humility. We are not perfect, never. So we can change our mind, we can become even violent, so democracy is the system that is better capable of making us in our craziness also moment, or crazy moment, capable of functioning inside of this process. In some sense, it's very hard to say this is not, this is. So you can have a democracy that is better than other democracy, more egalitarian, more attentive to diversity, more tolerant. There are moments in which we are so good as individuals in our life. There are moments in which we are crazy, and we have to make sense of that. So democracy cannot simply be the good thing. It's also something bad. For instance, not all majorities are good. Come on. I mean, not all the decisions are good. But we don't love democracy because of that decision. We love democracy because we can make a better decision or a change decision. So otherwise, it's a very poor thing. For this reason, now there are political scientists like Aken and Bartel. They tell us, look at democracy is not good at all. We are full of prejudice. We make bad vote and we vote in the wrong way. Why so? What does it mean to? So we destroy what democracy is about, which doesn't promise that we produce who knows what. So in some sense, I'm sorry, I talk too much.
No.
It was great. That question was great. So thank you. What's the name of this person?
Hayani.
Oh my God, great.
And you're one of her references. And so vou traduzir, I'm going to translate very briefly Professor Urbinati's answer. Então, ela falou que gostou muito da questão que foi colocada pela Hayani, e também falou, ela fez referência a um livro novo que está sendo publicado pelos colegas da professora, que é o Arato e Cohen. E nesse livro, eles defendem que o populismo é uma entidade híbrida. E eles recorrem à figura da mula. A mula não é nem uma vaca e nem um burro, é uma mula. E o populismo seria isso. E a professora Nádia discorda dessa visão, porque tem que tomar cuidado, ela diz, que quando você oferece a entidade híbrida é uma entidade nela mesma. Então, a gente tem que tomar cuidado, né, na nossa categorização do político, de não ficar criando novos regimes. Então, ela acha mais proveitoso a gente compreender o populismo como algo que está ali ainda no limite da democracia, e que isso também é interessante de fazer, porque a gente evita de cair naquela ideologia da democracia, de sempre ver a democracia como algo necessariamente positivo. A professora Nadia disse, existem maiorias que não são legais, né? A democracia, ela também, às vezes, pode ser meio complicada. Então, você, vendo o populismo como algo que, como uma razão para dar democracia. Professor Nadia Urbinati, thank you very much for everything. And so, yes, thank you very much.
No, I thank you. It was great. Great. It was, I thank you so much for this invitation, because both your question and this one, they made my mind work again, you know.
So I hope that we can connect again. Hopefully one day you'll come to Brazil to give us a lecture. I know that you have collaborated with public universities here before.
Yeah.
I hope this happens again. Wherever you go, I'll try, hopefully here at UNESPAR. If not, if elsewhere, I'll do my best to see you in person. Because like I said, you are an excellent political theorist and a great educator. In my introduction, I mentioned something that I'll never forget, because I remember when I wanted to study with you, and I sent emails, and you had to send me a document signed, and we hadn't met, and you did that. And I remember when I arrived in the first weeks, you said, "Oh, I'm happy that it worked out, your fellowship," because before there was a Brazilian student whom I didn't know and who emailed me, and he said, oh, I need you to send me a document, and I needed to send the document signed in paper. And I just thought, who does that? So I think it's in those small acts that we see a great educator, an educator who is concerned with students, and it's even with students who you don't know. So it's not many people do that, Nadia. So I think
good.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to have you, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good life.
Bye-bye.
Bye.